Kiki Camarena was not born into power. He was not born into wealth. He was born into something far more dangerous: conviction. Enrique Kiki Camarena knew what it meant to struggle, to work for something greater than himself. Born in Mexico but raised in the United States, he grew up in the fields, watching his mother break her back so her children could have a better life. He understood sacrifice from a young age, and that understanding would one day lead him straight into the heart of the most dangerous drug empire in the world. His path was not one of privilege, but of discipline. He joined the Marines, served his country, and when his time in the military ended, he chose law enforcement. First as a firefighter, then as a police officer, and finally as an agent of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The DEA was young in those days, formed just a decade earlier, but its mission was clear: stem the flow of narcotics into the United States. It was a mission that, in the 1980s, seemed almost impossible. The drug trade was not just a business, it was an empire. The cartels were not just criminals, they were warlords. In Mexico, there was one organization that stood above all others: the Guadalajara Cartel. Led by Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, this was the organization that controlled nearly every ounce of marijuana and cocaine that entered the United States from Mexico. Its influence reached deep into the Mexican government, its corruption infecting the very institutions that were supposed to fight it. Police officers were on the cartel's payroll. Politicians looked the other way. Judges feared for their lives. Kiki Camarena knew this. He knew the risks. He knew that taking on the Guadalajara Cartel was more than a job. It was a war. And yet, he volunteered. Assigned to the DEA office in Guadalajara, he made it his mission to bring the cartel to its knees. At first, he played the game carefully. He built a network of informants, gathered intelligence, and slowly began to understand the vast infrastructure of the cartel. They weren't just smuggling drugs, they were running a shadow government. They had their own security forces, their own financial systems, their own way of eliminating anyone who stood in their way. But Kiki was patient. He worked quietly, methodically. He infiltrated their world, learned their secrets, and most importantly, he found their weakness. Rancho Buffalo, a massive marijuana plantation hidden in the mountains of Chihuahua. It was unlike anything law enforcement had ever seen before. Thousands of acres, sophisticated irrigation systems, armed guards. A single raid on Rancho Buffalo could wipe out billions of dollars in cartel profits. And Camarena made sure that happened. It was the biggest blow the cartel had ever suffered. Mexican authorities, acting on DEA intelligence, raided Rancho Buffalo in 1984. They torched the fields. They arrested workers. The cartel lost an estimated $8 billion overnight. And that was when the clock started ticking for Kiki Camarena. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, these were not men who forgave. The destruction of Rancho Buffalo was not just a financial loss, it was an act of war. And Kiki had just painted a target on his own back. Word spread quickly. The cartel wanted revenge. They wanted to know who had betrayed them, who had given up the location of Rancho Buffalo. And more than anything, they wanted the man responsible to suffer. Kiki Camarena didn't run. He didn't hide. He had no illusions about the danger he was in, but he believed in the mission. He believed that justice was worth the risk. He had been fighting for something his entire life. Why should this be any different? But what Kiki didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the cartel's reach went higher than he had ever imagined. His enemies weren't just traffickers and murderers. They were politicians. They were law enforcement. They were the very people he should have been able to trust. And when the order finally came down to silence him, it was not whispered in the shadows of a cartel safe house. It was spoken in offices, behind closed doors, in meetings with men in suits who had decided that one American agent was worth sacrificing to keep the machine running. February 7, 1985. Kiki Camarena stepped out of the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. He had no idea it would be the last time. The Guadalajara Cartel was unlike any drug organization before it. It wasn't just a collection of criminals smuggling narcotics across the border. It was an empire built on blood, corruption, and absolute control. At the center of it all was Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather. He wasn't just a kingpin, he was a strategist, a businessman, and a master manipulator. Under his leadership, the cartels of Mexico were no longer warring factions. He united them, forcing smaller groups under his command, creating a network so powerful that even the Mexican government feared him. But he did not rule alone. He had two ruthless lieutenants, Rafael Caro Quintero, the hot-tempered and unpredictable enforcer, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, the old-school trafficker who had been in the drug game longer than anyone. Together, they controlled the entire flow of marijuana, heroin, and cocaine from Mexico into the United States. The cartel had its own army, hundreds of men trained to kill without hesitation. It had its own intelligence network, informants in police stations, government offices, and even military commands. It had its own system of justice. Those who betrayed them were not just killed, they were erased. Their families were destroyed, their names were wiped from existence. The cartel made sure that no one dared to defy them. Their business model was terrifying in its efficiency. They worked with the Colombian cartels, particularly Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel, to move massive shipments of cocaine through Mexico. Instead of smuggling small amounts, they started moving drugs by the ton. Their routes were protected by corrupt officials, their shipments secured by bribed soldiers. By the early 1980s, they were making billions of dollars every year. Money was everywhere. It flowed through their hands so fast that they had to launder it through real estate, casinos, and banks that looked the other way. Entire cities in Mexico thrived because of cartel money. Politicians were elected with drug profits. Police officers who once earned pennies were suddenly living in mansions. The cartel didn't just own the drug trade, it owned Mexico. And for a while, it seemed untouchable. The DEA was watching, gathering intelligence, but every time they tried to make a move, they ran into one problem: corruption. Every arrest order, every planned raid, every operation was leaked before it could happen. Informants inside the Mexican government made sure the cartel was always one step ahead. The DEA needed someone on the inside, someone who could infiltrate the cartel's world, uncover its operations, and find a way to destroy it from within. That man was Kiki Camarena. He was sent to Guadalajara in 1981. At first, he was just another agent, watching from the shadows, gathering intelligence. But as time passed, he started to get closer, too close. He was uncovering things the cartel never expected him to find. He was learning names, routes, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Then, in 1984, he delivered a devastating blow, the raid on Rancho Buffalo. That single operation cost the Guadalajara Cartel billions. It embarrassed them, it made them look weak. And it set off a chain reaction that would lead to something the cartel had never done before: the kidnapping and murder of a U.S. federal agent. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Caro Quintero, and Fonseca Carrillo held a secret meeting. The message was clear: Kiki Camarena had to be eliminated. And this time, they wouldn't just kill him. They would make an example out of him. Kiki Camarena was a marked man, but he didn't know it yet. After the Rancho Buffalo raid in 1984, the Guadalajara Cartel was in a state of shock. A single DEA agent had orchestrated the destruction of one of the largest marijuana plantations in history, an operation so vast it had generated billions in revenue. The cartel's leaders, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, were furious. They demanded answers. How had the DEA found Rancho Buffalo? Who had betrayed them? And, more importantly, who would pay for it? The name Kiki Camarena came up over and over again. He had been investigating them for years, but now he was no longer just an annoyance. He was a direct threat. He had to be dealt with. In the months that followed, the cartel's leaders grew increasingly paranoid. They were convinced there were informants inside their organization. They began torturing and executing their own men, trying to find the leak. But no matter how many bodies they buried, they kept coming back to one unavoidable conclusion: Camarena was the one who had to be silenced. And so, a decision was made. Kiki Camarena would be kidnapped, tortured, and interrogated. The cartel wanted to know everything: how much the DEA knew, who else was involved, and whether more agents were coming for them. But this wasn't just a cartel operation. It had government backing. Gallardo and his associates had deep connections within the Mexican Federal Security Directorate, DFS. the very agency that was supposed to be fighting crime. Instead, high-ranking DFS officials were working with the cartel, helping them smuggle drugs, launder money, and eliminate enemies. Some of these officials even attended cartel meetings, giving advice on how to handle the growing DEA problem. And now, those same corrupt officials would help orchestrate one of the most shocking crimes in DEA history. Behind closed doors, the cartel met with members of Mexican law enforcement. Plans were made, safe houses were prepared. Interrogation specialists, men skilled in extracting information through unimaginable brutality, were called in. Camarena never had a chance. On February 7, 1985, the order was given. The cartel had been patient. They had watched Camarena, studied his movements, learned his routines. They knew where he lived, where he worked, and most importantly, when he was vulnerable. That morning, he left the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara for what he thought was just another day. He never made it back. As he walked toward his car, a group of men surrounded him. Some were cartel enforcers, but others wore Mexican police uniforms. They were not there to arrest him. They were there to make sure he disappeared. Witnesses saw him being forced into a car. Some looked away. Others knew exactly what was happening but remained silent, because in Guadalajara, speaking against the cartel was a death sentence. Within minutes, Camarena was gone. Word spread quickly. The DEA knew something was wrong almost immediately. Their best agent had vanished in broad daylight in a city swarming with cartel informants. Calls were made, questions were asked, but the response from Mexican authorities was slow, too slow. Inside the cartel's world, Camarena had already been moved to a secret location, a house on Lope de Vega Street, a place that would soon become known as a house of horrors. The interrogation was about to begin, and the DEA was powerless to stop it. Kiki Camarena was no stranger to danger. He had faced down cartel enforcers, corrupt police officers, and government officials who wanted him dead. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen inside that house on Lope de Vega Street in Guadalajara. The house was not just a safe house, it was a torture chamber. The cartel had chosen it carefully. The walls were thick, designed to muffle screams. The floors were reinforced, ensuring there would be no escape. Inside, a team of interrogators, doctors, and cartel enforcers were waiting. Camarena was brought inside, his hands tied, his body already bruised from the struggle. He recognized some of the faces around him. Some were cartel figures he had investigated for years. Others were Mexican police officers. Men who were supposed to uphold the law but had instead sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. And then, there were the doctors. Men in white coats hired by the cartel not to heal, but to prolong suffering. Their job was to keep Camarena alive, to make sure he didn't die too soon. The interrogation began immediately. Rafael Caro Quintero, the cartel's violent and unpredictable leader, was the first to speak. His voice was sharp, filled with rage. "Who gave you Rancho Buffalo?" Camarena refused to answer. A punch to the stomach, then another. He gasped for air but remained silent. He knew what was coming. He had seen cartel victims before. Mutilated, broken, left as warnings on the streets of Guadalajara. He had always known this was a possibility. But the cartel wanted more than silence. They wanted answers. They wanted names. They wanted to know how much the DEA knew. Caro Quintero leaned in close, his breath heavy with alcohol. "Who else is working with you? How many agents are in Mexico?" Camarena didn't flinch. He stared back at them, refusing to give them what they wanted. The first blow with a baseball bat shattered his ribs. The second knocked the air from his lungs. The beatings continued, methodical, brutal. Then came the electrical shocks. Wires attached to his body, sending waves of pain through his nervous system. His screams filled the room, but the thick walls absorbed the sound. Outside, Guadalajara carried on as usual. No one knew that, inside this house, a DEA agent was being tortured to death. When his body grew too weak, the doctors stepped in. They injected him with adrenaline, forced him to regain consciousness. The cartel wasn't done with him yet. The torture lasted over 30 hours. Camarena, weak and bleeding, still refused to give them information. At some point, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo himself arrived. He was calm, collected, the businessman of the cartel. Unlike Caro Quintero, he didn't shout or rage. He simply watched, his eyes cold, analyzing Camarena as if he were just another problem that needed to be solved. Camarena's fate had already been decided. Eventually, the final blow came, a metal rod inserted through his skull, destroying his brainstem. The torture was over. The man who had dared to take on the Guadalajara Cartel was dead. But the cartel had made a grave mistake. They hadn't just killed a DEA agent, they had declared war on the United States. And the U.S. was about to respond with Operation Leyenda, the largest manhunt in DEA history. For over a month, Kiki Camarena's fate was unknown. The DEA searched, the U.S. government pressured Mexican officials, and rumors spread through the underworld. But in Guadalajara, where the cartel controlled everything, silence was the law. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and his associates knew they had crossed a line. Killing a DEA agent wasn't just another murder. It was a direct challenge to the United States. They had made a calculated decision, believing their power and corruption would protect them. But now, they had a problem. The U.S. government wasn't backing down. Pressure was mounting. Mexican officials were being forced to act. The cartel couldn't keep Camarena's disappearance a secret forever, so they needed to get rid of the evidence. Somewhere outside Guadalajara, in a remote location, a group of cartel enforcers dug a shallow grave. The orders were simple: bury Camarena and his pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avalar, and make sure they were never found. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Through a mix of intelligence, informants, and sheer determination, DEA agents working with the Mexican government uncovered a lead. On March 5, 1985, after weeks of searching, they arrived at a remote ranch in Michoacán, and there, in the dirt, they found Kiki Camarena's body. What they uncovered shocked even the most hardened agents. His body was bruised, broken, and barely recognizable. The signs of torture were everywhere: ribs shattered, his skull punctured, burn marks covering his skin. It wasn't just a killing, it was an execution, a message, and the U.S. heard it loud and clear. The moment Camarena's body was recovered, everything changed. The DEA was no longer just investigating a cartel. They were hunting them. What followed was Operation Leyenda, the largest manhunt in DEA history. The United States had just lost one of its own, and now they wanted revenge. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, they had ruled with impunity for years. But now their empire was about to start falling apart. The moment Kiki Camarena's body was found, the United States government declared war on the Guadalajara Cartel. For years, the DEA had watched from the sidelines, their hands tied by political restraints, Mexican corruption, and cartel influence. But now, everything was different. Camarena wasn't just another agent, he was one of theirs. And his brutal murder had crossed a line that no one, not even the most powerful drug lords in Mexico, could escape. Washington, D.C. erupted. Within hours, top officials from the DEA, CIA, FBI, and the White House gathered in emergency meetings. President Ronald Reagan himself was briefed. There was only one objective: find those responsible. Make them pay. The mission was given a name: Operation Leyenda. Unlike anything the DEA had attempted before, this was not just an investigation, it was a full-scale manhunt, the largest in the agency's history. The U.S. government put pressure on Mexico like never before. Diplomatic threats, economic pressure, intelligence operations, all of it was unleashed to force Mexico to act. And for the first time, Mexico had no choice but to cooperate. The hunt begins. The first target was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, one of the Guadalajara Cartel's founders. The U.S. knew he had been present during Camarena's torture, and they wanted him first. Under immense U.S. pressure, Mexican authorities raided one of his properties. Fonseca was found hiding in a mansion, surrounded by bodyguards. But he didn't go down in a hail of gunfire. Instead, he was escorted out in luxury, given time to pack his bags, and treated with the respect of a businessman rather than a criminal. The DEA was furious. They wanted justice, but corruption still ran deep. Fonseca was sentenced to prison, but under comfortable conditions. He lived in a luxurious cell, still conducting business. It was not enough. The DEA needed more. The next target was Rafael Caro Quintero, the man who had personally overseen Camarena's torture. By the time Mexican authorities moved in, he was already gone. He had fled to Costa Rica, living under a fake identity. But he couldn't run forever. With DEA intelligence and U.S. diplomatic pressure, Costa Rican officials tracked him down. April 4, 1985, Rafael Caro Quintero was arrested. He was dragged out of his safe house, disoriented, his reign of terror finally catching up to him. Back in Mexico, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But the U.S. wasn't satisfied. They wanted him extradited, wanted him to face American justice, but Mexico refused. And then, years later, in 2013, Caro Quintero was suddenly released on a legal technicality. The U.S. was outraged. He had vanished again. For years, he remained in hiding, until 2022 when he was finally recaptured. The Godfather on the run. With two of the cartel's leaders taken down, only one remained, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the godfather of the Guadalajara Cartel. Unlike Caro Quintero, Gallardo was careful. He didn't act on impulse. He didn't let emotions control him. He knew the walls were closing in, and he planned his escape carefully. He went into hiding, moving from place to place, relying on his network of corrupt politicians, military officials, and police officers. For years, the DEA hunted him. Then, in 1989, the net closed. Mexican authorities, under unrelenting U.S. pressure, finally arrested Gallardo in his home. The Godfather had fallen. The once mighty cartel that had ruled Mexico with fear, corruption, and bloodshed was now leaderless. But while the Guadalajara Cartel collapsed, its fall would give rise to something even worse, the modern Mexican drug cartels. And the drug war was far from over. The Guadalajara Cartel had been the most powerful drug empire in Mexico, a criminal organization that operated with near-complete impunity. But after the arrests of Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the empire was left in ruins. However, in the world of the drug trade, power does not disappear. It shifts. And the fall of one cartel did not mean the end of the drug war. Instead, it meant the beginning of something even worse, the birth of the modern cartels. With its leaders gone, the Guadalajara Cartel split apart. New leaders, former lieutenants of Gallardo, saw an opportunity to take power for themselves. They were no longer interested in working together. Instead, they divided Mexico into territories, setting the stage for a new era of brutality, betrayals, and all-out war. Among them were three key figures, men who would shape the next several decades of cartel violence. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, a former underling of the Guadalajara Cartel, who would go on to form the Sinaloa Cartel, which would become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, a ruthless trafficker who took control of drug smuggling routes and later created the Juárez Cartel, known for its violent expansion and wealth. The Arellano Félix brothers, a brutal family that broke away and founded the Tijuana Cartel, controlling drug routes on the U.S.-Mexico border through sheer terror. The Godfather's final play. Even behind bars, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo still wielded influence. He knew the future belonged to the next generation of traffickers, so he orchestrated the division of the cartel from his prison cell. He made calls, arranged meetings, and decided who would control which territory. But these men were not like him. Gallardo had operated in the shadows, using corruption and political alliances to maintain power. The new cartels were different. They were younger, more aggressive, and more violent, and they didn't want to share power. Soon, what had once been a single cartel running Mexico like a well-oiled machine became a fractured landscape of warring factions, assassinations, and unprecedented bloodshed. Mexico falls into chaos. The Mexican government struggled to contain the situation. With the fall of the Guadalajara Cartel, they had expected peace. Instead, they got endless violence. Cartels now fought not only against law enforcement, but against each other. They massacred rivals, bribed officials, and turned entire cities into war zones. The brutality reached levels that even the Guadalajara Cartel would never have imagined. Bodies were hung from bridges. Journalists were assassinated in broad daylight. Entire towns were abandoned, left to cartel rule. And through it all, one truth remained. Kiki Camarena's death had not stopped the drug trade. If anything, it had made it even more deadly. The U.S. and Mexico had taken down one empire, but in its place, they had created a battlefield. The war on drugs was far from over. It was just getting started. Kiki Camarena's death had changed everything. The United States had always fought drug trafficking, but now it was personal. His brutal murder had proven that the cartels were not just criminals, they were a direct threat to U.S. national security. And so, America declared war. The rise of the DEA's power. Before Camarena's death, the DEA had struggled for influence. It was a relatively small agency, constantly battling bureaucratic restrictions and international politics. But after 1985, the DEA became a powerhouse. Budgets increased, the U.S. government poured millions into the war on drugs, agents were given more authority, the DEA expanded operations, recruiting more personnel and establishing stronger intelligence networks, a new level of aggression. U.S. agents now worked more directly with Mexican law enforcement, military units, and even intelligence operatives. The message was clear: no more Camarenas, no more letting the cartels operate unchecked. America's shadow war in Mexico. Publicly, the U.S. focused on diplomacy, pushing Mexico to crack down on traffickers, increase security, and fight corruption. But behind the scenes, covert operations were already underway. Mexican military units trained by the U.S. were sent to hunt cartel leaders. Black Ops missions targeted drug shipments and secret cartel compounds. CIA involvement increased, using Cold War-era tactics to disrupt the drug trade. For the first time, the cartels were not just fighting Mexican authorities. They were facing the full force of the U.S. government. But there was one problem. The cartels were adapting. The cartels fight back. The U.S. thought that by taking down the Guadalajara Cartel, they had won a major battle. But in reality, they had started a war they could not control. The new cartels were even more violent. They no longer feared the consequences because they had already seen the worst. Corruption had only grown. Even as the DEA worked harder, the cartels were bribing officials at every level, making it impossible to fully dismantle them. Trafficking routes became more sophisticated. New smuggling techniques, underground tunnels, and even submarines allowed them to move drugs faster than ever. And then came the ultimate move. Instead of just bribing politicians and police, the cartels built their own armies. Former soldiers and special forces joined the drug trade. Groups like the Zetas, made up of ex-military operatives, turned cartel enforcement into full-scale warfare. Cartels began using military-grade weapons, armored vehicles, and even drones. They no longer feared law enforcement, they executed them. Suddenly, Mexico wasn't just dealing with organized crime. It was facing narco-insurgency, a war between the government and cartels that rivaled some of the worst conflicts in history. The drug flow never stopped. Despite all the U.S. efforts, one fact remained true: the drugs never stopped flowing. Cocaine, heroin, and marijuana still flooded into the United States. A new drug, methamphetamine, became a major cartel product, and soon, fentanyl would become the deadliest crisis of all. Billions of dollars were spent, countless lives were lost, and yet the demand for drugs in the U.S. remained unchanged. As long as Americans kept buying, the cartels would keep supplying. Kiki Camarena's sacrifice had ignited a war. But it was a war that no one seemed able to win. The war on drugs was no longer just a battle between the U.S., Mexico, and the cartels. It was something far more complex, something far more dangerous. Because behind the brutal killings, the drug busts, and the high-profile arrests, there was a hidden truth that no one in power wanted to admit. The cartels didn't just control the drug trade. They controlled Mexico itself. A system built on corruption. For decades, corruption had been a part of Mexican politics. But after the fall of the Guadalajara Cartel, it became the foundation of the drug war. Cartels didn't just pay off police officers and local mayors anymore. They bought governors, military commanders, federal agents, even presidents. Bribes turned into entire government salaries. Entire police forces worked for the cartels. Politicians accepted cartel money to fund their campaigns. In return, they looked the other way. High-ranking officials warned cartel leaders before raids. Judges released drug lords with a single phone call. The cartels had infiltrated every level of the system. And that meant that even when the DEA or the Mexican government captured a major drug lord, the cartel itself kept running, because the people in power wanted it to. The pact between narcos and politicians. Even Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the so-called godfather of the Guadalajara Cartel, had once held meetings with Mexican officials. He operated under government protection, ensuring that as long as he paid his dues, his empire would be allowed to exist. And even after his arrest, that same unspoken agreement continued with the cartels that followed. The PRI government, which had ruled Mexico for over 70 years, was deeply intertwined with the drug trade. The Mexican military fought certain cartels while secretly working with others. Presidents publicly declared war on drugs while quietly negotiating with drug lords. The result? The cartels weren't just criminals, they were part of the government. The cost of speaking out. Anyone who tried to expose this corruption did not live long. Journalists who investigated the cartels were assassinated in broad daylight. Honest police officers were killed by their own commanders. Politicians who refused cartel money mysteriously disappeared. And as the violence escalated, it became clear that no one was safe. Not even the U.S. government. The CIA and the cartels? A dark connection? For years, rumors circulated about the CIA's involvement in the drug trade. Some claimed that during the Cold War, the CIA had turned a blind eye to cartel operations in exchange for help fighting communist rebels in Latin America. Others believed that the agency had actively protected certain cartels, using drug money to fund secret operations. The truth was murky. But one thing was clear. The war on drugs was never about destroying the cartels. It was about controlling them. The never-ending cycle. Despite everything, the arrests, the murders, the billion-dollar investigations, the cartels only grew stronger. And by the time the 2000s arrived, the new wave of cartels was more powerful, more violent, and more untouchable than ever before. Because as long as corruption remained, the drug war would never be won. It would only evolve. And Kiki Camarena's death, the moment that had sparked the U.S. crackdown, would become just one chapter in an endless cycle of bloodshed. Kiki Camarena's murder was a message, a brutal warning from the cartels that they were untouchable, even against the might of the United States government. But the DEA was about to send a message of its own. It would be called Operation Leyenda, the largest U.S. investigation into a single murder in history, and it would shake the very foundations of the drug trade. A personal mission for the DEA. For the agents of the DEA, this was not just another case. Camarena had been one of their own. His murder was not just a crime, it was an act of war. And that meant the response would be unlike anything the cartels had ever seen. The DEA's top agents were handpicked for the operation. Some had spent years working undercover in Mexico. Others had hunted drug lords across the world, but they all had one goal: find the men responsible, make them pay. Hunting the killers. The investigation quickly uncovered the extent of the conspiracy, and as abduction had been ordered at the highest levels of the Guadalajara Cartel. Corrupt Mexican officials had not only known about it, they had helped plan it. Even the CIA's involvement in Mexico was now under suspicion, but the DEA didn't just want to know who was responsible. They wanted to bring them down. Operation Take No Prisoners. For the first time in DEA history, agents were given the green light to use unconventional methods. Rogue DEA teams worked outside official channels, targeting cartel informants. Bribes were turned against the cartel, using corrupt officials to feed information back to the DEA. Mexican witnesses were secretly taken to the U.S. for questioning, avoiding cartel retribution. And when legal channels failed, the DEA made a decision. They would kidnap suspects off the streets of Mexico. The abductions begin. One by one, the men involved in Camarena's murder vanished. Cartel operatives were snatched from their homes and taken to the U.S. for interrogation. Corrupt officials who had once felt untouchable now found themselves being hunted. Even high-ranking cartel bosses began to disappear. The operation was so aggressive that it sparked a diplomatic crisis between the U.S. and Mexico. But the DEA didn't care. They had one name left on their list: the man who had given the order. The fall of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. In 1989, the DEA's relentless pressure finally caught up with the godfather of the Mexican drug trade. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the mastermind behind the Guadalajara Cartel, was arrested in Mexico. The DEA had its victory, but it was a hollow one. Did justice even matter? Gallardo was sentenced to 37 years in prison, but his empire did not die with him. Instead, the cartel fractured, giving birth to the modern drug war, one that would be even more violent than before. And Kiki Camarena? His killers had been caught. His murder had been avenged. But the drug trade was stronger than ever. The war on drugs had not been won. It had just begun. Kiki Camarena's murder was supposed to be a warning, a message from the cartels that they were beyond the reach of the law. But instead, it became the catalyst for a war that would never end. His death forced the U.S. and Mexico into an all-out battle against the cartels, a battle that would escalate into one of the deadliest conflicts of the modern era. But as the years passed, it became clear that justice came at a cost, and that cost was never-ending bloodshed. The drug trade thrives. Despite all the arrests, the assassinations, the billions of dollars spent on law enforcement and military operations, the drug trade only grew stronger. New cartels emerged, more violent than before. Drug routes became more sophisticated, stretching across the globe. Political corruption remained untouched, ensuring that no real change was possible. Camarena's sacrifice had changed the war, but it had not stopped the drugs. The DEA's frustration. For the DEA, Operation Leyenda had been a victory. Dozens of cartel members were arrested, key informants were exposed. The U.S. government sent a clear message: no American agent would be murdered without consequences. But the deeper the DEA dug, the more they realized a harsh truth. The war on drugs was unwinnable. Cartels could be dismantled, but new ones would always rise. Drug lords could be arrested, but corruption ensured that another would take their place. And most of all, as long as there was demand in the U.S., there would always be supply from Mexico. A cycle of violence. The fall of the Guadalajara Cartel had not brought peace. It had unleashed chaos. Mexico became a battlefield. Cities turned into war zones as new cartels fought for power. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Thousands disappeared, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. The violence escalated beyond anyone's control. No longer just a drug war, it became a fight for survival. And as the years passed, the body count only grew. One murder had changed the course of history, but history refused to learn its lesson. Camarena's legacy today, Kiki Camarena's name, is synonymous with sacrifice. His murder led to the biggest crackdown on drug trafficking in history. His story became a warning about the dangers of fighting the cartels. His legacy lives on in the DEA, where new agents swear to continue the war he started. But for all the bloodshed, all the arrests, all the wars, the drugs still flow. And the war that Camarena's death ignited? It never ended. It only evolved. The fall of the Guadalajara Cartel should have weakened the drug trade. It should have made trafficking harder. It should have been a victory. But instead, it created something far worse. By dismantling Mexico's first major cartel, the DEA had shattered the old order. In its place, chaos took over. A new breed of cartel. With Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo behind bars, the cartel he once controlled split apart. The Sinaloa Cartel. Led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, it would soon become the most powerful drug syndicate in history. The Tijuana Cartel. Ruthless and bloodthirsty, it took control of the U.S.-Mexico border. The Juarez Cartel. Experts in smuggling, they expanded the cocaine trade to unimaginable levels. The Gulf Cartel. They had money, power, and an army of mercenaries at their disposal. But the most dangerous evolution was yet to come. The rise of narco armies. The Guadalajara Cartel had bribed officials. It had corrupted politicians. But the new cartels? They built armies. Former Mexican special forces joined the cartels, creating paramilitary death squads. Cartels equipped themselves with military-grade weapons, armored vehicles, and advanced technology. Entire towns were turned into cartel strongholds, where law enforcement feared to enter. Suddenly, this wasn't just organized crime. It was a war between the state and the cartels. The unstoppable drug flow. Despite decades of crackdowns, the drug supply to the U.S. only increased. Cocaine shipments reached historic highs. Methamphetamine production exploded. Heroin was replaced by fentanyl, a synthetic opioid more powerful than anything before. The cartels had perfected their business, and as long as Americans kept using, they kept supplying. Did the DEA make it worse? Looking back, some in the DEA wondered, had they made the problem worse? Yes, they had taken down the Guadalajara Cartel, but in doing so they had created multiple cartels, each more violent than the last. Instead of one enemy, they now had dozens. Instead of a controlled operation, they now had a fragmented war zone. The monster could not be killed. The truth was clear. The war on drugs was not stopping the cartels. It was only forcing them to evolve. And with each attempt to dismantle them, they became stronger, richer, and more violent. Kiki Camarena's death had sparked a war. But now, it was a war that no government in the world could win. Kiki Camarena's murder had been a turning point. But as the years passed, declassified documents, whistleblowers, and investigative journalists began to expose a disturbing reality, one that suggested the war on drugs was never what it seemed. Because while the DEA had gone to war with the cartels, other branches of the U.S. government may have been playing a different game entirely. The CIA's alleged role. For years, whispers circulated that the CIA had been deeply involved in Mexico's drug trade. During the 1980s, the U.S. government was secretly funding the Contras in Nicaragua, a rebel group fighting against the leftist Sandinista government. That funding required money, and according to multiple reports, some of that money came from drug trafficking. Mexican cartels, including the Guadalajara Cartel, allegedly played a role in smuggling cocaine to the U.S., with profits funneled back to the Contras. And that raised a chilling possibility. Did the CIA turn a blind eye to cartel operations, or worse, did the agency actively protect them? A cover-up in the making? Camarena's investigation into the cartel wasn't just about drugs. He had reportedly uncovered something much bigger. He suspected that elements within the Mexican government were protecting the cartel. He had learned about secret airstrips used for smuggling cocaine. He may have even discovered ties between cartel operations and the CIA's involvement in Central America. And then, suddenly, he was dead. Confessions from the shadows. Years later, multiple sources, including former cartel members, DEA agents, and journalists, would claim that Camarena's torture session had included more than just drug lords. Some said that a CIA operative had been present, not to help the cartel, but to find out what Camarena knew. Others suggested that the U.S. government quietly shut down certain lines of investigation after his death. And then there was the biggest question of all. Why had so many cartel members been arrested, yet so few corrupt government officials? A war that was never meant to end. As the years went on, the contradictions piled up. The U.S. spent billions on the war on drugs, but drugs remained more available than ever. Cartel leaders were arrested, but their replacements were just as powerful. The DEA hunted traffickers, but the drug trade itself never slowed down. For some, the answer was clear. The war on drugs was not meant to be won. It was meant to be managed, because as long as drugs flowed, as long as cartels operated, and as long as billions of dollars moved through the system, too many people in power had too much to gain. The ghost of Kiki Camarena. Today, Camarena is remembered as a hero. His name is honored in DEA ceremonies, his story told as a warning about the dangers of fighting the cartels. But for those who dig deeper, his story is also a reminder of a harsh truth. Justice is never simple. And sometimes the greatest battles are not fought against criminals in the shadows, but against the powerful forces that keep them there. Kiki Camarena's murder was supposed to be a warning, a message carved in blood that no one, not even a U.S. federal agent, was untouchable. But the men who ordered his death had underestimated one thing. The fire they had ignited would never be extinguished. The drug war escalates. In the years after Camarena's death, the United States doubled down on its war against the cartels. The DEA's budget skyrocketed. Billions were poured into intelligence, raids, and undercover operations. Mexico's military was deployed to fight the cartels. Soldiers patrolled cities, but the violence only grew worse. New laws made drug trafficking punishable by life sentences, but even as traffickers were locked away, the drugs kept flowing. Yet for every kingpin arrested, for every cartel dismantled, the drug trade adapted. Cartels became more violent, more organized, and more unpredictable. The war on drugs had become a war without end. The human cost. The numbers are staggering. Over 400,000 people have been killed in cartel-related violence since Camarena's murder. 100,000 plus people have disappeared, their bodies never found. Millions of Mexicans have been displaced, fleeing cartel-controlled regions. In the U.S., drug overdoses reached record highs, fueled by fentanyl, heroin, and cocaine. And the worst part? There is no sign of it stopping. Was it worth it? Some DEA agents, the very men and women who swore to continue Camarena's fight, have begun asking a painful question. Did any of it matter? The cartel that tortured and murdered him was destroyed, but in its place rose something worse. The traffickers who killed him were caught, but thousands of others stepped in to replace them. The war on drugs became more aggressive, but the drugs never stopped flowing. For every ounce of justice that came from Camarena's sacrifice, a river of blood followed. A name that won't be forgotten. Despite it all, Kiki Camarena remains a legend. His name is etched into DEA headquarters. A foundation was created in his honor, educating youth about the dangers of drugs. Every year, Red Ribbon Week is held in his memory, a national campaign against drug abuse. But perhaps his greatest legacy is this. He forced the world to see the truth. He exposed the corruption. He revealed the power of the cartels. And even in death, his story refuses to be silenced. The war rages on. Decades have passed since Camarena's murder. The faces of the cartel leaders have changed. The routes, the products, the methods, they've all evolved. But the war remains the same. The money still flows, the drugs still move, the blood still spills. And the question that lingers over Camarena's legacy remains unanswered. If the war on drugs hasn't been won, was it ever meant to be? Decades have passed since Kiki Camarena's death, but his story still haunts the world. His murder was meant to be a message, a warning from the cartels that no one was untouchable. But instead, it became a rallying cry. The war on drugs did not end with Camarena. It only escalated. The cartels became more powerful, more brutal, and more deeply embedded in politics and law enforcement. The drug trade expanded beyond Mexico, spanning the globe with operations in Asia, Europe, and Africa. The violence became an unstoppable machine, consuming entire generations in its path. The question now is no longer about stopping the cartels, it's about survival. A war without a victor. In the end, who really won? The DEA fought harder than ever, but the drugs never stopped. The US and Mexican governments spent billions, but corruption still thrives. Cartel leaders were arrested, but their organizations only grew stronger. Kiki Camarena's sacrifice was not in vain. He exposed the truth. But the truth was darker than anyone imagined. This war was never meant to be won. What you need to know. If there's one thing to take away from this story, it's this. The drug trade isn't just about criminals. It's about power, money, corruption. Governments wage wars they can't win. The cartels evolve, adapt, and expand. And in the middle of it all, innocent people pay the price. What do you think? Now we turn the question to you. Is there any way to truly stop the cartels? Or will the war on drugs continue forever? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more real, untold stories of crime, corruption, and power, subscribe to our channel. Because the past isn't just history, it's a warning.